Hello students and welcome to the Introduction to Unit 5 Part 2. In this part we are going to look at representing relations and functions in general. Our essential questions are, what are the 5 major ways of representing relations and functions? Which of the ways have you already learned, which will be 2 ways of the 5? Which of the ways are you going to learn, which will be 3 new ways? And what do these representations look like in general? Now, we've already learned that relations and functions both represent relationships. As we learn to understand the relationships that exist in our world, we hope to share this information with others. Think of the newspaper, the news, etc. How often do you see representations of relationships? Very often. For example, let's just look at baseball. In baseball, you see and hear a lot of relationships. For example, during the 2014 season, the Baltimore Orioles won 59% of their games. That's a relationship comparing the season to the amount of wins that they had. How well the Phillies do in their game today may depend on the amount of rain that occurs prior to start time. So the result of their game is depending on the amount of rain that happens. A player's on-base percentage is calculated by on-base percentage equals the number of times on base divided by the number of times at bat. So the percentage depends on 2 things, the number of times on base, and the number of times at bat. These are all relationships that you've heard but haven't really contributed to being a relation or a function. Or maybe you've seen an input-output chart, something like this, that organizes information in columns and rows. Or a graph that shows the relationship between 2 numeric values, such as the days prior to game day and the price markup or down relative to when that game is going to occur. These 5 baseball relationships that I showed you were all the representations of functions. The first one that I showed you, which was during the 2014 season, the Baltimore Orioles won 59% of their games, that was called representing the function in context. We looked at one specific example. Although seasons and wins are always related, we only looked at one season. So if you take a problem and you look at only one specific situation, then you're looking at it in context. The second way is in words. The second example I gave you said, how well the Phillies do in their game today may depend on the amount of rain that occurs prior to start time. This was describing the relationship in words, which means to describe the relationship in general using depends on or is a function of. We did this many times in Unit 1 Part 1 as we were trying to decide whether a situation was a relation or a function. The third way, which I showed you with this example, is as an input-output table. An input-output table is used to show a few possible contexts organized by columns and rows. The fourth way is as a graph. So this was in a graph. It had an x-axis and a y-axis. A graph is used to show many possible contexts on a coordinate plane. It visually shows the trends. And last, as an equation. An equation means to write a consistent relationship, well then you know it's a function, in terms of variables so that any context can be calculated. Now, I want to clarify, not all equations are functions, but when it has that consistent and predictable relationship, it will often be a function, and we'll learn to decide whether an equation is a function or not later. But here was the example I gave you with baseball. We could figure out anyone's on-base percentage using this idea. So to summarize this introduction lesson, there are 5 major ways of representing relationships. In context, which means to look at a specific situation. You have done this since kindergarten. In words, to describe a relationship in general by saying or writing a depends on statement. Your test score depends on how much you study. That we learned in part 1, looking at a relationship in words. In this unit, Unit 5, Part 2, we're going to look at how to create an input-output table, which will show a few possible contexts organized by columns and rows. We will learn to create graphs, which show possible context on a coordinate plane. And we will also learn to write and use equations, which we know represent a consistent relationship that can be applied to any context.